Welcome, everyone. Um, my name is Kathy Jones. I'm the moderator of tonight's Sappy Hour, and I'm glad you're able to join us on this call. To begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. And I would like to acknowledge that I am at home, which is on the North Shore of Long Point on Lake Erie. And this location is on the traditional lands and homes of the Haudenosaunee, the Adirondack, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississauga peoples. And I am within the 1792 Treaty 3, which is sometimes called the Between the Lakes Treaty. Now, all the panelists and guests are meeting here from many areas across Turtle Island. So I ask that you take a minute and reflect on the lands where you live and where your atlas. And maybe later, if you'd like to do this, you might want to visit the Whose Land link, and I'll add it in here. No, Kaylin already has, and that'll allow you to look up whose territories and traditional lands that you are on. Tonight we have a great talk, and I'm so excited to share it with you. We're all about gaps today, all about Atlas gaps. In the first part, Mike and Kaylin will be discussing the data coverage gaps and how they plan to address it this year, or we, because we're all involved. And then we'll have a special guest who will talk about the photo gaps and what we need to fill them and how to you can help tackle that. Like we have this big document that we have to develop at some time. So again, we all need to be involved with developing that. So many of you have probably already attended Sappy Hours before, but some folks may not have. So for your new folks to this event, a Sappy Hour is a play on the term happy hour, and with a little bit of a vibe about our Atlas mascot, the sapsucker. It's an opportunity to relax and learn more from the Atlas team and from special guests, and a chance to get to know more about the project and to ask all your questions. We love questions here. Now, some housekeeping. You're all on mute because it's a webinar, but we want to hear your questions. So there's a Q&A option in Zoom, and add your questions to that, and we will get to them later on in the program. And if you're on Facebook, you can add them to the comments in Facebook Live under the post, and we will find those and we will share those questions as well later. We're also recording this, and the final recording will be on the Alice YouTube channel in the next few days. So let's get started. To begin, we will be hearing from Mike Burrell, the Atlas coordinator, and Kaylin Boomalis, the Atlas project manager. Now, most of you already know Mike and Kaylin, so I won't give you a long introduction. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to Mike and Kaylin.
Okay, so I'm actually going to start. And can I get a thumbs up from somebody yep, perfect. Thank you. All righty. So yeah, I'm going to start and then turn it over to Kaylin, and then we'll hear from John about the photos. Okay, so Atlas gaps. We were talking about how we were going to present this. What is an Atlas gap? What are the different types of gaps? And there's a lot of different types of gaps. There's data gaps, there's species gaps, there's photo gaps. So we're going to break that down. But before we get too far into what these gaps are, I wanted to just take this minute to remind everybody about our coverage goals. So we are into year 5 of 5 for data collection. We started in 2021, and we have varying coverage targets based on where you are in the province. So as a reminder, the province is divided into 47 Atlas regions, administrative regions, and then each of those regions is divided into 10 by 10 kilometer Atlas squares, and that's how we measure our effort at the square level. So when we talk about getting complete coverage in an Atlas square, we mean it's getting 20 hours of effort during the peak breeding season. So that's May 24th to July 10th in Southern Ontario and June 1st to July 10th in Northern Ontario, and 25 point counts. Now there's lots of optional surveys. We're not going to talk too much about those optional surveys tonight. We will a little bit, but we're going to focus more on that complete coverage, or adequate coverage as we call it on this slide, of 20 hours in peak season and 25 point counts. The number of squares in the part of the province that we're targeting to have complete varies depending on where you are. So in Southern Ontario, the darkest green on this map, we're talking about our goal of 100% of Atlas squares getting complete coverage, so 20 hours and 25 point counts. In the roaded northern part of northern Ontario, that sort of medium green, that area we're looking for 5% of squares to have complete coverage. And then in the furthest north part of Ontario, where there's not a lot of roads and access is very difficult, we're talking about aiming for 2% of our squares to be covered. So that's our refresher on what we're talking about coverage. Now, Kaylin's going to talk in a little bit about how we're doing in with some different maps to show different metrics, but we wanted to show you all how to find this information on your own, so you can do some planning on your own after this presentation, maybe leading up into the field season. So the number one tool that you're going to use is the Atlas coverage map. So I'm going to actually switch over and show you a live demonstration of how to use the Atlas coverage map to find Atlas gaps. So give me a second here while I close out this slideshow for now and switch over to the Atlas website. Still seeing that screen, right? The Atlas website now?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So on the Atlas website, to get to our Atlas coverage map, you want to head to our Atlas website, birdsontario.org, and then underneath tools and resources, there's a mapping resources section, and there's a few different things there, but we're going to aim for the coverage map. So let's open up the coverage map, and on the coverage map, you're going to see a zoomed out map. If you zoom in on your mouse, once you get in further into the map, you will start seeing the Atlas squares showing up. So great, you know where the Atlas square boundaries are. That's not that helpful yet. If you click on a square, it will tell you what the square ID is, in this case 17 TPK 63. It will tell you what region it is in. That's handy if you want to get in touch with the regional coordinator to know which region you're talking about. But then it'll also tell you a whole bunch of metrics about what coverage is like in that square. So in this particular square, we're just about at that 20 hours of peak effort, and we're just about at the 25 point counts. We're just shy. So a little more effort's needed in that square. But what's more useful on this coverage map is that you can select different layers. You can turn on some options like showing Atlas regions, the region boundaries. I like turning that on. It helps with my brain, the way it works. Then let's select a layer. So I'm going to say, let's look at the number of hours during the peak period. So I've selected that. I need to click update the map. And now you have a color-coded map. And if you don't know what those colors mean, there's a little legend in the bottom. So the lightest shading of color is less than 10 hours. The medium shaded color is 10 to 19. And then the darkest is greater than 20. So the thing that stands out to me when I'm looking at this for Southern Ontario, this is the area that we're trying to get 100% coverage. We're actually doing pretty well. There's a lot of those squares that are really dark. I don't know, orange. I guess that's orange. Um, so this makes things a little easier to quickly locate where there's areas that have lots of squares that need help. So if we were in the Guelph area, we could zoom in. There's Guelph right here. And so there's not that many squares really close to Guelph. There's a few, there's some up in the Tottenham area. There's this square here that needs some help with hours. Out near Palmerston, there's another square. And out near Woodstock, there's another square that is lacking hours during that peak season. If you click on one of those squares, then you'll be able to see exactly what it is. So this square only has 6 hours of effort. And you can find the square ID and you can find which region it's in. So those would be good ones to target by contacting the regional coordinator and saying, hey, I could help out getting some peak hours. You can do the same thing for other layers. So let's look at point counts. We're going to update the map. And let's say we're out in the Kingston area. And there's some squares north of Kingston, up near the Perth area that have 0 point counts. That's so they're not even shaded in at all. There's some squares even closer to Kingston, like TU 18 TUQ 82, that has only 4 point counts. So again, use the different layers to help target which squares need help for this sort of thing. So point counts, peak hours, and there's all the special surveys as well are here if you want to use the coverage map that way. The other handy one when you're looking for atlas gaps is the number of species. And so in this one, let's go over to the Peterborough area, and we can see there's some of these squares that have lighter shading, so fewer species compared to the surrounding areas. And so those might be areas that maybe they have enough effort, but they're missing lots of species still, and those would be good ones to go target. This square, for instance, only has 30 species. So there's definitely more than 30 species in a 10 by 10K square in this part of the province. So that would be a place that could use some help. It also needs lots of hours, doing pretty good for point counts. Okay, so that's one way that you can plan where and find places that need help with gaps. The other place that is handy to know about is the square summary sheets. And I know these will be familiar to some of you. A square summary sheet is a very cool thing. I'll show you one in a second. There's two different ways to get to the square summary sheets. So one is from this coverage map. So for this square here, if we clicked it, there's a link under beside the Atlas square. It's actually a link, and we could click that, and that'll take us to the square summary page. If you wanted to go straight to the square summary page, you can actually find it from Tools and Resources, Mapping Resources, and then on the Square Resources page, you just type in the square, and it'll pull up the square summary sheet. Let's go to it this way and open up this square summary sheet. Now, these are very handy for helping you figure out which species need to be found still or should be found still. So the square summary sheet up at the top, it tells you some summary stats comparing the current atlas to the previous atlas. So it tells you the number of species that have been found. So there's 30 total. Of those, 26 are possible breeders, 2 are probable, and 2 are confirmed. But then it tells you the last atlas. The last atlas, there was 87. So I was right. There should be more species than 30. It also tells you how many hours have been put in and how many point counts have been put in compared to the 2 atlases. On the species page, species list, it will tell you the previous atlas results. So what was the highest breeding evidence found in that square last atlas? That's the previous column. So in the last atlas, there was Canada goose with fledged young. And then the code column is the current atlas. So what's the breeding evidence that we have in that square so far, this atlas? And so not surprisingly, a lot of these are missing because there's only 30 species so far. And then the percent column is also quite handy. It tells you what percentage of atlas squares in that atlas region have reported breeding evidence for that species. So if you're going to target filling some gaps at the square level, it's useful to know what species were recorded last atlas, and also which species have been recorded nearby, but maybe not last atlas. So you can really quickly scroll through here. You see Canada goose, wood duck, mallard, green-winged teal, hooded merganser, common merganser. All those were reported last atlas and have not been found this atlas. The square summary sheet also underlines some species that are more common in that region. So they've been reported on more than 50% of the squares in that region, like wood duck, Canada goose, mallard. The green-winged teal is not underlined. It's a pretty rare breeder in the area, even though it was found last atlas. All right, so that's another really handy way to plan how to fill gaps on a particular square. And then the last tool that I wanted to show was the species maps, the interactive species maps. So I'm going to go back to the Atlas website under Tools and Resources again, and Mapping Resources. I'm going to the interactive species map. All right, so I'm going to start with an American robin. Okay, so you've got to select the species you want. You need to select your project. So in this case, the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, and make sure you specify the years 2021 to 2025 because we're talking just about this atlas. We're not looking at the maps from the previous 2 atlases. We want to see, are there any gaps for a particular species? Maybe it's your favorite species, or maybe it's a species you know how to survey for really well, or maybe it's just a species you're interested in. So American robin is the species where we have records, breeding evidence records from the most atlas squares out of any species. We have over 3,000 atlas squares with breeding evidence reported. The map, when you're zoomed out, is at the 100-kilometer block level. Once we zoom in, we'll see the individual 10 by 10K squares. And those are the squares and blocks are color coded. So gray represents squares where there's records, but no breeding evidence has been reported yet. Yellow are the squares where there's possible breeding evidence, so things like suitable habitat or singing birds. Orange are probable, so that could be a pair or a singing bird present on territory. And then red are confirmed level breeding. So nests with young, nests with eggs, fledged young, things like that. So lots of confirmed breeding evidence. I'm going to zoom in on southern Ontario for this species, let it load up the squares, and you can see we have a ton of squares filled in. And it's pretty impressive to see how many squares have been filled in for a species like American robin. But there's still a couple squares that, down near Sarnia, there's a square, near Stratford, there's a square where we only have possible breeding evidence. There's more squares as you get up onto the Canadian Shield where we only have possible breeding evidence. There's not really any that we're totally missing for this species, so that's great in that sort of continuous southern Ontario coverage, 100% coverage zone. But there's still places where, well, you could go out and find a used nest, or in the breeding season, it's not too hard to find American robin nests. Okay, but another species I'm going to show you is a species that is nesting or is starting to start its breeding season now, white-breasted nuthatch. And so let's just focus in on Southern Ontario again. There's lots of gaps. Even through Central Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, there's gaps. Some of those might be real gaps where the species just does not breed. There's not enough forest in that 10 by 10K square, but a lot of them, we know that they probably are there. They just haven't been found yet. So this is another way you can pull up the map. You can find squares that don't have a species, and you can go target that if it's in your area. There's lots of squares that are yellow. Those ones are suitable to try to upgrade from possible breeding evidence to probable. And for a species like white-breasted nuthatch that's singing on territory right now, it's not too hard to upgrade those possibles to probable by finding one that's singing in the same place a week or more apart. So those are a couple species. I highly encourage you to play with this map, pick a species, and then see if you can upgrade some breeding evidence for that species or find some gaps where it hasn't been reported yet. All right, I'm going to go back to the slides, and I think it's time for me to turn it over to Kaylin. Yeah, go for it, Kaylin.
Was muted. Yeah, this is perfect transition to talking about some of the gaps or some of the coverage for the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas so far. And so this map is showing Southern Ontario up to our 100% coverage line, which cuts through the North Bay region and the Blind River regions. So the squares that are blank have less than 1% of species reported from Atlas 2 to Atlas 3. And as the shade gets darker, the higher the percentage of species that have been reported. There are some squares that have more than 100% of the species reported from Atlas 3 compared to Atlas 2. And those will be represented in those darker purple, I guess, squares. And so you can see some regions like the Waterloo region, all of the squares have more than 90% of the species reported. Ottawa is doing really great in terms of species reported as well. Muskoka, a lot of the places that have really good coverage of their squares in terms of total hours and total point counts are also going to have a higher number or a higher percentage of the species reported to date. As you get further north, it's obviously more challenging to survey as you get closer to that 100% line, just because of, the accessibility in some of those squares is definitely not easy. Unpredictable road networks and just, fewer folks up there as well. One thing with the species that Mike was saying is that you can look at those square summary sheets if you are near a square that has a low percentage of species reported to date. You can look at those square summary sheets to check out which species are missing and whether you feel the species are missing are because of lack of habitat, if the habitat has changed, or if it's just not everywhere has been surveyed in the square just yet. So definitely check out those square summary sheets and talk to your regional coordinators as well, like Mike was saying earlier. Next slide, please. This is the same thing, but for the roaded north. And so those are the blocks. So as Mike was saying, as you get further north, we don't want 100% of squares because that would be unattainable in this part of the province. So we want 5 squares per block with adequate coverage, so 20 hours and 25 point counts. This map is comparing Atlas 2 to Atlas 3, so the percentage of species that were reported in Atlas 3 compared to Atlas 2. But I'm only comparing here the squares that have had 50 or more species reported in Atlas 2. Because of course, if it had 1 or 2 species reported in Atlas 2 and someone has gone in and done a decent amount of atlasing now in Atlas 3, that would be kind of, not really a fair comparison. So we've done squares that have at least 50 species or more in Atlas 2. As you can see, a lot of the squares actually had greater than 90% of species reported. You can see as you get closer to some of those cities and towns, Thunder Bay, Rainy River, Timmins, there's more squares that have a higher percentage of species just because people live closer to those places. But even as you get further afield, there's still lots of squares that have a decent number or decent percentage of the species reported to date. Next slide, please. I've shown this map a couple of times, but again, in Southern Ontario, we want every single square to have the 20 hours and 25 point counts, or that's our coverage goal. So this is showing squares, the gap squares. So the blue ones have less than 15 hours of effort during the peak period. The yellow ones have less than 15 point counts, and then the red ones have less than 15 hours and less than 15 point counts. So the red ones are obviously the higher target squares up kind of near Lake Nipissing, although some of those red squares are Lake Nipissing. Up in the Sudbury region, some squares in the Bruce and Grey counties, and then obviously Algonquin can be challenging and a bit inaccessible, so there's quite a few good squares in there as well. So in the next slides, I think the next one's peak hours. Yep. This one is showing squares that have then less than 20 peak hours, so squares that are not yet at our coverage goals. And here we've accounted for the squares in Southern Ontario that are greater than 50% water. So I've whited those ones out, as you can see, and have just left the blue squares that have less than 20 peak hours or less than 20 hours during the peak period. You can see kind of in around the Peterborough area, all the way up to Algonquin, there's definitely some squares that need some effort. And then again, as you get closer to that Central Ontario line, there's a lot of squares that people might not have gotten to yet. We do have some creative ways of filling those that I'll talk about in a little bit, but definitely talk to your regional coordinators if there's any of these squares that you think that you might be able to get to this upcoming field season for our last field season. Next slide. And this is showing the same thing, but with point counts. I've showed less than 20 point counts because some people are working on off-roads this upcoming field season. And you're seeing the same sort of trend, except Peterborough is doing a lot better in point counts than they are in their peak hours. Algonquin, again, some in Parry Sound, that have been challenging to access, and same in kind of those Sudbury regions and the Nipissing area as well. Point counts as you get further south are faring a little bit better than they were in terms of the peak hours, but still in the Bruce and Grey counties, there's some point counts to be done as well. So if you're in those areas, we will be doing a square bash in that area this upcoming season. So definitely join us for that if you're interested in getting some point counts done. Next slide. All right, this is the kind of gaps for the roaded north. It's a little bit harder to tease out the point count and peak effort needs for this kind of on the larger block level because it is, again, just 5 squares that need to be completed for each block. And so the ones that are grayed out are blocks that we are considering to be complete or have reached their minimum coverage goals of 5 squares, 5 squares per block with the peak hours and point counts complete. The ones that are not shaded in at all have 0 squares complete with the peak hours and the point counts. So those zone line blocks are the ones that are incomplete to date. People have been focusing their efforts on those larger blocks to try to get those 5 squares done. Um, in the Kenora and Rainy River regions, there are some blocks that are almost there, 4% of squares complete. So just one more square out of those blocks would need to be done. And then the other ones are at 3%. So just a couple more squares. So we're making really good progress on the road to north. And I think just with a little bit more effort, we'll be there. So if you live or recreate up in this area and you think you'll be close to any of those blocks, definitely let your regional coordinator know. Next slide. These are some backcountry trips that we're promoting this upcoming season. So what we've done is Atlas staff have put together 14 canoe or backpacking trips in kind of that central Ontario area or in places that are otherwise kind of challenging to get the square coverage in. So they've put together 14 itineraries. So they tell you where to start, where to park your car, how far in you're going to have to go to get the survey coverage, and how much coverage is needed in each square. And then they kind of lay it all out for you, and you just have to pack your canoe or pack your backpack and be on your way. So these are all in undersurveyed areas, again, and really challenging places to get to. They are varying skill levels, so you'll definitely have to check out the website and read the itinerary. We do give an estimated kind of difficulty level, and we give a little bit of an explanation on why we've rated it a certain way. So definitely take those into consideration when you're thinking about picking out one of these trips. But for each one, we recommend reaching out to the appropriate regional coordinator so that we don't have two people duplicating the same trip and, when they potentially could have gone elsewhere. So definitely take a look at our website. I can post that in the chat in just a minute once I'm done talking here. Next slide. Okay, this one I think is back to Mike.
Yeah, that's back to me. So you can put the thing in the chat,
Perfect.
the address in the chat. Yeah, so I'm gonna finish. I've got two more slides here to talk about some more gaps. So this is one of our special surveys. So I said we'd mention special surveys, and I wanted to save it to the end of our talk here. This is showing the routes completed for the Central Owl Survey Protocol and the Northern Owl Survey Protocol. And it also includes coverage from the Ontario Nocturnal Owl Survey that Kathy coordinates. So it's pretty impressive when you look at it on the map, how many surveys have been done, the number of, the darker the blue, the more surveys have been done in that particular square. This survey protocol starts April 1st. So that sounds like a long time away, but it's actually only a few weeks away, which is absolutely bonkers. But there's still lots of areas through central and northern Ontario that we could use more of these surveys. It's a really fun way to go out for the evening. Takes a few hours to run 10 stops for the most part. I guess Northern Ontario, when you're doing the official protocol, it's how many is it 20 stops, Kathy?
Depends on snow load, somewhere in between 10 and 20.
Okay. But the cool thing about doing it with the Atlas is you don't have to do all 10 or all 20 of those stops in a night. You can do just a few and spread it out over a few nights. The skill level required for this is pretty low. You don't need to be able to identify like every single bird species in Ontario. You really just need to know how to identify the target owl species, really. So, pretty fun excuse to go out and do some owl surveys. I should mention that the regional coordinators have portable broadcast, portable speakers that are available to be borrowed because you need a portable speaker to run these. You can run it off your car as well. So this is the central. There's gaps basically everywhere. So no matter where you live, if you're in central or northern Ontario, um, you could run this survey. The other survey for owls that's on now is there's the Eastern Screech Owl survey, and this is getting pretty covered, pretty impressive. But there's still lots of places out in Grey Bruce, in the Kitchener-Waterloo, sort of Brantford to Woodstock area, and then Chatham, Kent, Essex, Sarnia kind of area. and then east of Ottawa as well. There's pretty big gaps in terms of we could fill in a lot more squares. This survey protocol started March 1st and runs to the end of April. So you could be doing it now. I know there's been people out the last few nights getting screech owls. And similarly, there's the Northern Hawk Owl survey protocol that's running right now in Northern Ontario. It started March 1st as well and runs through May. So there's 4 different owl surveys either going right now or will be going starting April 1st. Good excuse to get out, collect some breeding evidence data um, for the Atlas. And the really cool thing is we actually have a owl survey challenge going on right now. From March 1st to April 30th, every time you enter an owl survey into the Atlas, you're entered into a draw for a pair of Vortex binoculars. So if filling those gaps and turning some of those squares blue wasn't enough, you have a really good chance to win some binoculars. So just wanted to make sure everybody's aware of that challenge that started March 1st and runs till the end of April. All right, that's it for me. I don't know, Kathy, are you going to introduce John?
Yes, I was planning to.
Okay, go
Um,
for it.
all right, thank you. That was very interesting. I love the owl stuff, but then I'm kind of biased. So thank you too for sharing. If anybody has questions for Kaylin or Mike on gaps and where you can be the most help, or just anything to do with gaps and surveys, put them in the Zoom Q&A or in the Facebook comments, and we'll make sure they get asked. Now, let me introduce you to our next speaker, which is John Riom. John is a member of the Atlas Photo Working Group and is going to spend a few minutes talking about the Atlas photo needs. John's birding passion began during the summer of 1984 when he worked as a natural resource technician at Point Pelee National Park. Photography became a passion a few years later, and he has been actively photographing birds for the past 37 years. Over the years, John has been fortunate to have several of his photos published, including the cover shot of the second breeding bird atlas 20 years ago. He currently works as a rural family physician in Mount Forest and serves as an assistant clinical professor at McMaster University. So let's turn this over to John and go for it.
All right. Thank you, Kathy, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to speak on behalf of the Photo Review Group. And our group's mandate is to select photos for each of the breeding species in Ontario for publication ultimately in the Breeding Bird Atlas book and or the website that will accompany that. Our committee consists of 7 judges. Some of these people you'll know well, like Mike Cadman, also Roxanne Fillion, Ann Coor, Kurana, Missy Mandel, Mark Peck, Jeff Skevington, and myself. So our progress to date, there's been a little over 5,500 pictures so far submitted for consideration, and the group is about 2/3 of the way working through those images. Each of the judges will pick their top 2 favorite images for consideration going forward with the project. So our short-term objectives are to create a list of species that we think we could use more photos for consideration. And we wanted to get this list done before the main part of this breeding season so that we could share that with the Atlas community in terms of helping us to fill the gaps of those missing photos. Also, a mandate is that we also want to include as many different photographers as possible to hopefully have images that will be published in this book. And at the present time, we have about 45 different photographers who've made the top 2 lists of at least one of the judges. So the criteria for photo selection, the main and most important thing is it actually has to be technically an excellent photo. So that means that we want it to be properly lit, it has to be focused and ideally well composed and basically pleasing to the eye. It should be possible to think that this photo was taken in Ontario. So, you know, if you're taking a picture of a bald eagle flying in the sky, one from Florida will look much the same as one flying in Ontario. But if it were to land in a palm tree, that would clearly not be an Ontario photo, and we would probably not look at that photo closely. So it should have at least appear to have been taken in Ontario. So the photo book itself is only going to have 1 photo for each species, whereas on the website, we're likely going to have multiple different photos. So there's a good chance of photos making the website for sure. But with the book, we're going to be really more biased to selecting a breeding adult in their spring plumage. So the basic picture has to be, as I said, sort of technically excellent, but there are other features that would make the photo stand out amongst its peers. And so ideally, if it were to demonstrate some form of breeding behavior, like a singing adult or a pair together, or maybe one of the birds doing a breeding display, carrying some food or nesting materials, maybe a distraction display, possibly at a nest. If there's a family group shot, like a goose with its goslings, for example, those would all give a one up to that photo over its peers. And there's not a specific breeding category that trumps another. So if it shows any one of those characteristics, that would give it a leg up over its peers. Another thing that would help is if it's recognizably in a suitable breeding or nesting habitat. And again, obviously, we want it to look like it's from the breeding season. So not a shot in the winter necessarily, or something that might look like it's during migration. So ideally, in its suitable nesting habitat would also give a plus for that photo. So in terms of making your photo look a little more likely to get picked. Mike, maybe you can show that slide now of the red crossbills. So these two photos are of a single photo. The first shot is on the left in the top is of a red crossbill shot as is from a full frame camera. And you can see the bird is centered, dead center, and there's a lot of space in front of the bird, above the bird, and behind the bird. But just by simply cropping the photo to get rid of all that wasted space behind the bird and some of the space above the bird, it's the exact same photo, but when the judges are looking through the collection, I think the one that's more cropped on the bottom right is more likely to stand out, even though it's exactly the same photo as the other one. So there's many, many things you can do to enhance your photos, and that may not be in everyone's skill set, but probably the simplest thing is just to crop and make the subject stand out a bit more and maybe get rid of some of the distracting background. So that would be, if you're submitting photos, a simple way to make your photo look a little more presentable. Again, it would have to be technically good as we crop photos. Any errors in focusing would become more apparent as you're zooming in. But if you have a good quality photo, just doing a simple crop can really enhance it. So far, our group is about 2/3 of the way through the photos that have been submitted, and we hope to complete that task, our first pass of those 5,500 photos, by the end of March. And so far, even at the 2/3 mark, we have a want list of about 87 species, which I think we're going to show at the end or at some point, or an attachment at the end of the presentation. Um, and several of these species, we actually do have some photos, but we might be looking for more variety. For example, it might be a great photo, but taken in the winter, or perhaps it's a juvenile or a female, not sort of demonstrating the breeding plumage. It could be a great image, but maybe it's a little soft, or a great image and maybe the lighting is a bit harsh. So there's a number of these ones that we still would like to see more variety submitted. And these things that we're looking for, they're not always what you would imagine as like the most difficult species. So there's species that you would imagine, like the three-toed woodpecker or the barn owl, that might be very hard to get photos of. But there's actually lots of common birds that we still need photos. For example, just to pick a few out of this list, we need more photos of the American crow, of the belted kingfisher, of the Cape May warbler, of common merganser, a great horned owl, even birds like herring gull and ring-billed gull, house finches and northern cardinals, red-tailed hawks. I just cherry-picked some of those species from the list that you're looking at, and a lot of these birds are quite common, and hopefully many of you have photos that you'd be willing to share with us that we could consider. And I just wanted to sort of finish this presentation with just mentioning a number of birds that are already beginning breeding in this month. And so really the Atlas season has begun in many ways. And from a photography perspective, these are birds that are on our want list, and we could be actually getting breeding evidence photos up. So, for example, the mute swan, safe breeding dates begin at the end of this month, March 31st for the southern area, and by April 14th in the boreal area. Same with the trumpeter swan. The mourning dove, as of March 15th, is considered safe breeding for the mixed woods, and by April 15th up in the boreal area. Eastern screech owl and great horned owl have already been breeding down south at this time of year. The screech owl by February 14th in the boreal, and same with the great horned owl. The barred owl, as of the end of this month, is considered breeding in both regions. And the crossbills, like the red crossbill we were just looking at, as well as the white-winged crossbill, they could be breeding year-round. So there's opportunities for some species already that we could hopefully get some photos and hopefully share with the community for consideration of this project. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting and very helpful. So, and thank you, Mike and Kaylin, for earlier sharing about gaps. Now, we do have a couple questions. If I follow right, John, though, if people get out with their cameras in their yards, say in the next few months, just near home, they could get some really good photos that we need for common species, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
That's
Things like
correct.
mourning doves, for example, many people might have those breeding in their backyard. So great
Okay.
opportunities right in your backyard, hopefully.
Right in your backyard. All right, so then we'll go over to our questions and people, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Facebook, in the comments, or add them to the Zoom Q&A. We have a couple questions to begin with. The first one is from Ryan Boudreau, and he would like to know how fast do the square summary sheets get updated?
Yeah, great question. So they slow down over the winter, but we were just chatting with Nature Counts today, like an hour and a half ago, and so those they just got updated again, like an hour ago, maybe 2 hours ago, and they should be updating every 24 hours. So usually it's around dinner time, and they should update once a day. But if you've been paying attention, they haven't been updating lately. But that should be back to 24 hours now.
That's an automated process then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. Our next question's a little longer, and it's from Sharon David. And I think she's got a very important question here, and I think everybody's probably asking similar questions. If one has to choose between trying to get a confirmed breeding from a species that is missing or taking on an adjacent square that has not been surveyed, no hours and no point counts, I presume the one lacking survey is more important.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, the short answer to that is yes. If you have to choose between upgrading breeding evidence and getting more coverage, spatial coverage across a greater area, then definitely go to the neighboring square or to the square, over yonder to get more atlasing done.
Okay. Now, I have a question for John. Anybody else's questions before I end up talking, please add them because I will ask questions. So add your questions so you don't have to listen to Kathy. I have a question for John. You said that there is 2 photos per judge considered. So that means you have, I forget how many you said, 8. So you have 16 judges, 16 photos per species that you look to make your final decisions off of.
Yeah, so there are 7 judges, and at the present time, we're just trying to take a quick survey of what we have and what we need. So the way we set it up is each judge is going to take their top 2 picks, and we expect that there will be waves of photos coming in over the next year, and so likely we'll get a new batch of several thousand, and wade through those and sort of pick our picks from that one, and the picks will sort of move forward over time to the point near the end of this process when we have to make a final decision from the narrowed down categories that we've made so far.
Okay, thank you. Now, I guess my next question is for Kaylin and Mike. You were mentioning things like right-breasted nuthatches. Now, a lot of people have feeders. I have feeders, and I'm getting 2 nuthatches regularly. And I'm thinking, well, how do you know if they're breeding pair or they're just there? Now, you mentioned singing on territory at least twice a week apart. Is that the best way of knowing?
Yeah, so white-breasted nuthatches right now are in sort of the shoulder season, we call it, in the sort of breeding calendar where I mean it's not a highly migratory species. They do move around a little bit, and so we just want you to be extra sure that you're not just getting a bird that's passing through. White-breasted nuthatch may be not a huge risk of that, but because we're in that shoulder season, we're not in the safe dates when you can be sure that any bird you observe is a nesting bird in that area. We want you to use higher level breeding codes. So we don't want you to just use the S code and the H code in that shoulder season. So white breast nuthatch is in that shoulder season for I don't know it off the top of my head. I think probably sometime in April is when the safe dates kick in. So right now, if you saw them building a nest, then obviously they're nesting in the area. Go ahead and do that. But so the easiest way to get elevated breeding evidence for a species like white-breasted nuthatch is the T code, so the territory. And so the territory code is used when you have singing bird 7 or more days apart. So in my backyard, I have white-breasted nuthatches, and they've been singing basically since the start of January. And the song of white-breasted nuthatches that I don't know. I'm doing a horrible job of that. It's not just the like it's the more long drawn out song. And so if you're hearing that, that's the territorial display. And if you've got that regularly happening at least a week apart, then you can start using the T code. So I've been using the T code since the start of February, I think, when they entered into that shoulder season. Because I've got them in my backyard. It's harder when it's an area that you're not in all the time. But yeah.
I'll have to take another listen. I suspect I do have breeding pairs, pair at least, but I'll have to take another listen. So thank you. I have no other questions. So thanks everybody for the questions. Um,
I have
Kaylin
just a
looks like
quick one. Yeah, I
oh,
have just a quick one. It was just in the chat. And so someone asked how to submit photos, and I did post back in the chat just to say we have a media submission page, and I posted the link. However, if people are just watching this on YouTube after the fact, that's not going to be very helpful for them. So if you go onto our website, birdsontario.org, there's a Get Involved tab, and under that, there's a media submission button. So if you're watching this after the fact and you don't have access to the link that I shared in the chat, then that's how you get to it.
okay, cool. All right. So, that's good to know. And speaking of the website, we should also mention the Discord server if people have questions when we're not around, or else they can email the general email for the Atlas, which is atlas@birdsontario.org. Another great place for questions. I should also mention that this recording is going to be posted to YouTube. Now, Kaylin, Mike, John, do you guys have any closing remarks or announcements to make?
I think we
yeah,
have a few announcements. I'm just going to get the discussion forum link to put in the chat. So I'll let Mike go ahead with the announcements.
I actually have another question if we can do that first.
sure.
Sure. This is from Angie, and it is, how important is it to get new annual breeding evidence for species, even as if it is not higher in evidence in prior years?
Yeah, good question. So it's similar to the question I think Sheila asked earlier about how do you prioritize what you're going to do? Because there's all sorts of things you can do. You can go get new records of breeding evidence in a square. You can upgrade things. You can go do new squares. Um, so we want to encourage people to spread their effort out to get that minimum coverage, the adequate coverage in squares. That's our number one priority. That being said, if you happen to be out in a square already, even though it's got the 20 hours or however many hours it's got, I'll use my backyard square as an example. It's got plenty of hours in the square I live in. But it's still useful to be putting in repeated observations. So you've got checklists. You've got a checklist every day. That's awesome. It just helps feed into the models that we're using to estimate a relative abundance and probability of observation and those sorts of things. So very useful if you're collecting data anyways. Definitely record the breeding evidence that you're seeing, even if it isn't going to upgrade it in that square.
Okay, she had another question, but it was basically the same thing. And I think you answered that. Priority, yes, we want to get everything covered, but if you're there anyways and you're collecting data, you might as well put it in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. All right, now I'll turn it back over to you two for any updates. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I have one more. If a person uploads a photo for eBird, will that photo be seen as a crew who is looking for photos? My guess would be not likely, but John, you could probably respond to it. Or maybe Mike.
Yeah, there's no direct link. I mean, it might help us in terms of if we're really hurting for photos, we might go look for photos in a place like eBird and then reach out to observers who have put photos there, but it's not going to automatically get into the system. And I would say you have a very low probability of that being used in the atlas. I'm not going to rule it out, but we don't have any way to use photos that are in eBird. They're we need to have a photo license to be able to use those photos. So
Yeah, I was going to suggest that if the only person who has the rights to use those photos in eBirds is eBirds, because that's who you're given permission to,
yeah.
and you haven't given permission to all those other groups. So that's something to keep in mind if you think it's good enough for the Atlas. Definitely put it in both places. Yeah. Okay, that's it. We're actually done with the questions.
Okay. Well, yeah, we have a few announcements. I already mentioned the Owl Survey Challenge, but I'll mention it again. And maybe Kaylin, you can get the challenge website and put that in the chat. Just if you want to get more information about our monthly challenges. Um, we have another challenge coming up in April. So the Owl Survey Challenge is going to run till the end of April, but we're going to have another one coming up. And that will be based on photos and photo submissions. So um, the photo group that John's a part of, they're working on getting that list whittled down to what are like our highest needs for photos. And so the April challenge is going to be about submitting photos of some of those um, missing species. So maybe I'm not saying you should, but maybe you want to hold on to those photos until April 1st to increase your chance of maybe winning a pair of binoculars at the same time. Um, that's the April challenge. And then we've got some square bashes that we're excited to talk about. We'll have a newsletter coming out in a couple weeks, so you see more details there. But we have a square bash. We want to make sure people know the dates. So we have a square bash planned in the Bruce Gray area the weekend of May 24th. Starts technically on the Friday, the 23rd. And that'll go at least till the Monday. And then the following weekend, which is May 30th. May 30th is the Friday, and it'll run until June 4th, is at Silent Lake. And then the next one is June the 6th to June the 11th, and that's at Bonachère Provincial Park. So we'll have registration for those up real soon on the Atlas website. You'll see more information in the Atlas newsletter. Kayla and I love doing those square bashes. We get to hang out with Atlasers and camp and have fun. So we hope to see you out at some of those square bashes. And then I don't know, do we have any more announcements you want to mention, Kaylin? I know you got another question that came in through Facebook.
Yeah, I think that was it for announcements. So I just had that one last question. And it's from Wendy. Welcome, Wendy, again. Good to see you, or I guess have you here. So Wendy says, I understand that the photo name requires specific details regarding species and photographer. However, the photo submission page requests other info for each photo regarding location, story, etc. Is that necessary or possible if you're sending a number of photos in a Google Drive link? Do you want me to just answer this right away, Mike, or do you want to answer it? Just answer my own question. Okay, I can answer it. Yeah, so really that is for a lot of kind of the outreach we do in our summarizing and celebrating. Sometimes we share funny stories that people share with us because everyone likes to hear, those stories from the field. So that's why we have those. And if you do have a photo with a very interesting story that you would prefer to share the story alongside it, you can still use the media submission page for that photo and write your little blurb. But if there's just a bulk a bunch of photos that you want to send to us in bulk, you don't have to include the location and story for every single one. You can just include, the species details and the photographer details in that Google Drive link.
But you still want the name and the species in the photo. That's really important because it helps make sure the credit is given to the right person, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. Or if it's a duckling that I can't identify, then I have to go around to everyone that I know that can potentially identify ducklings. So makes it a little bit easier and streamlined.
Okay, I guess that's everything, folks. Thanks again, John, for joining us tonight, and Mike and Kaylin for giving such a great presentation. I guess I will say goodbye to everyone. Enjoy your birding. Get out there and look for owls and nuthatches and northern cardinals not in the snow. Um, and have a great March.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, especially to Kathy and John and to everyone who came tonight. Bye, everyone.
Everybody.
Bye. Thank you. Good night.